Picture this. December 11th, 1944, 11:55 p.m. 5 Japanese ships sliding through black water toward a Philippine beach. Confident. Routine. They'd done this 9 times before, landed 34,000 troops through this exact corridor. Tonight would be no different. Except on the shore, something was waiting that shouldn't exist. Something that would rewrite the rule book of modern warfare in the next 18 minutes. Here's what the War Department received 3 weeks later. A single-page report. 15 rounds fired. 5 enemy vessels destroyed. 0 American casualties. Estimated 750 enemy dead. Weapon used? Tank destroyers. Read that again. Tank destroyers. Not battleships, not aircraft, not naval guns. Tanks. When that report landed on a desk in Washington, the first reaction was simple. Someone made a mistake. Because tanks don't sink ships. They never have. Not in Europe, not in the Pacific, nowhere in military history. This would be like claiming a bicycle outran a fighter jet. It doesn't just sound wrong, it violates everything we understand about how war works. And yet, 3 weeks later, when investigators finally dragged themselves to that muddy Philippine beach, when Navy divers went down into Ormoc Bay and measured the wreckage, when metallurgists examined shell fragments pulled from Japanese hulls, they found something that changed U.S. Army doctrine forever. The report was accurate, every word of it. So here's our question for the next 35 minutes. How does the impossible become real? How does an infantry division, men trained to dig foxholes and take hills, end up destroying an entire enemy convoy using weapons that were never meant to float, much less fight at sea? The answer isn't what you think. This isn't a story about crazy bravery or desperate improvisation. This is a story about mathematics, about older men who'd lived through the Depression and understood cost, about a general who believed courage without firepower was just expensive suicide. This is about the night doctrine died and cold calculation took its place. But to understand how 3 M10 tank destroyers accomplished something that sounds like fiction, we need to understand where they were, why those Japanese ships had to come, and most importantly, what made the men waiting on that beach different from every other American unit in the Pacific. Because when those vessels crossed into Ormoc Bay at midnight, they weren't entering a harbor. They were entering a carefully designed killing zone, constructed by men who'd already decided one thing. The manual was a reference, not a rule. Let's start with the water itself. Ormoc Bay doesn't look important on most maps, just a shallow curve on Leyte's western coast. No dramatic cliffs, no famous beaches, nothing that makes tourists stop and take photos 70 years later. But by December 1944, this unremarkable piece of water had become the most dangerous place in the Philippines. Not because of what was there, but because of what it represented, the last door still open. Every other route was sealed. American aircraft owned a daylight sky. Destroyers and cruisers prowled at night. Eastern ports were ash. Mountain roads were graveyards. That left exactly one option for Japanese command: this bay, this approach, this narrow window to keep their ground war alive. And the Japanese kept coming, because General Tomoyuki Yamashita had done the math. Without reinforcements, the 35th Army on Leyte would be strangled. No ammunition, no food, no replacements. With reinforcements, even costly ones, they could keep fighting, keep bleeding American forces, keep delaying the inevitable push toward Luzon. So Ormoc stayed open through sheer force of will. Even when half the convoy died, even when most troops drowned before reaching shore, every week of delay was worth it. Every American casualty elsewhere justified the losses here. And they used it hard. From late October through December 11th, 9 major convoys forced their way into Ormoc. Not small reconnaissance, not desperate attempts, organized reinforcement operations. Roughly 34,000 Japanese troops landed through this corridor, despite absolutely brutal losses. The Butcher's Bill tells you everything. The Japanese lost at least 20 transport vessels, 6 destroyers, 1 submarine, 3 escort ships, and a patrol boat trying to keep this funnel open. The Americans lost ships too, 3 destroyers, 1 high-speed transport, 2 landing craft. This wasn't a backwater. Naval historians would later call Ormoc Bay one of the most sustained interdiction battles of the entire Pacific War.
That calculation, ugly but consistent, explains why 5 ships were approaching that beach at midnight on December 11th, even after months of carnage. They weren't blind, they weren't stupid, they were executing orders based on strategic logic that said, delay is victory. But something had changed that the Japanese didn't know about yet. 7 days earlier, on December 7th, the 77th Infantry Division had landed south of Ormoc in an amphibious assault nobody expected. Within 72 hours, they'd advanced 23 miles, smashed through prepared defenses, crossed rivers under fire, and taken Ormoc town itself. The place was rubble, but capturing the town didn't stop the ships. They kept coming at night, unloading troops onto beaches still within range of Japanese defensive fire, betting that the Americans couldn't be everywhere at once. On paper, that bet should have worked. The Navy couldn't patrol shallow water constantly, PT boats were effective but limited, aircraft couldn't see through darkness without illumination, and infantry divisions weren't equipped to fight ships. Standard doctrine said this should have been a stalemate. Reality said something different. It said, adapt or watch men die for nothing. This is where everything turns, because the 77th Infantry Division wasn't thinking like standard infantry anymore. They'd learned too much, seen too much, survived too much to care what the manual said when the math pointed another direction. They had M10 tank destroyers positioned for direct fire support against ground targets. They had mortars capable of firing illumination rounds. They had anti-aircraft guns that didn't care what they were pointed at. They had machine guns with clear fields of fire. And they had time to think. Ormoc Bay forced a simple equation. If a ship reaches the beach, it unloads men. If it unloads men, Americans die later taking those positions. Therefore, the ship cannot reach the beach. It doesn't matter who stops it. It doesn't matter what weapon does it. It only matters that the ship stops moving troops. That logic transformed Ormoc Bay from a harbor into something new, a controlled trap with overlapping fire, timed illumination, and weapons never meant for naval combat, all aimed at one truth. Shallow water limits speed, dark hills block escape routes, and once a ship commits to the approach, it can't maneuver freely. Every advantage favored defenders willing to pull the trigger. By the night of December 11th, the Japanese were still treating Ormoc as a viable entry point. The Americans were treating it as a pre-registered kill zone. And at 11:55 p.m., 5 Japanese ships sailed directly into the center of that zone.
Before we get to those 18 minutes, you need to understand who was waiting on that beach. Because this wasn't a battalion of 19-year-old Marines jacked up on adrenaline and propaganda. This was something different. The 77th Infantry Division was never supposed to be exceptional. Reactivated in March 1942, filled mostly with men from New York and New Jersey, reservists, late draftees, men already past the age where the Army liked to see infantrymen. Their average age hovered around 32. In an army where 19 and 20-year-olds were standard, that mattered. Other divisions noticed. The jokes started quietly, then spread. The nickname stuck. The old bastards. What doesn't get mentioned enough is that the men accepted it. They didn't try to outrun younger units. They didn't compete on aggression. They didn't romanticize bayonet charges or frontal assaults. They'd lived too much life for that. These were taxi drivers, accountants, factory workers, men who'd raised families, paid mortgages, survived the Depression. They understood cost. They understood waste. When they learned war, they approached it like any other problem. Solve it efficiently, or people die for nothing. The numbers tell the story better than any speech. Across the entire Pacific War, American forces killed roughly 2.2 million Japanese soldiers and captured about 50,000. That's a 2.2% capture rate. The 77th Infantry Division killed over 43,000 enemy soldiers and captured 358. That's a 0.8% capture rate, one-third the rate of every other American unit in the Pacific. On Leyte alone, in 6 weeks of fighting, 19,456 Japanese killed, 124 captured. Those aren't numbers that come from reckless courage. They come from a doctrine built around firepower, patience, and refusing to expose men unnecessarily. And that doctrine had a name at the top: Major General Andrew D. Bruce. Bruce was 49 when he took command, a career artillery officer who believed in mathematics, not slogans. He believed courage without firepower was wasteful, that maneuver without support was suicide. He trained the division accordingly. Emphasize fire discipline, avoid frontal assaults, go around strong points instead of through them, let artillery and heavy weapons do the killing. Infantry exists to occupy ground, not to die proving bravery. Nothing about Bruce's approach feels dramatic. It feels cold, almost bureaucratic, and yet it produced results that shocked even other American commanders. The 77th didn't fight harder than everyone else. They fought smarter, and they accepted being called slow or cautious if it meant their casualty lists stayed shorter. Guam proved it first. When they landed in July 1944, expectations were low. Then the real defenses appeared: caves, jungle fortifications, machine guns buried in rock. Where younger units might have charged, the old bastards surrounded positions, shelled them into silence, then moved in. Guam fell by August 8th. The division's casualty ratio stunned observers. Leyte was worse. When the 77th was diverted from rest and sent straight back into combat, there was no grand speech about glory, just preparation, maps, timetables, fire plans.
When Bruce ordered the amphibious landing south of Ormoc on December 7th, it wasn't bold for boldness's sake. It was calculated. 3.5 miles from town, unexpected, disruptive, and fast. Within 72 hours, they'd advanced 23 miles and taken Ormoc. That speed wasn't youth, it was planning. It wasn't courage, it was coordination. By the time Japanese ships approached the bay on December 11th, the men on shore weren't exhausted amateurs reacting emotionally. They were veterans who'd already learned one lesson across multiple campaigns: if you let the enemy dictate terms, you pay in blood. This is where the division's personality matters. A younger unit might have waited for the Navy, might have hesitated, might have worried about doing something outside doctrine. The old bastards didn't have that instinct. They'd already broken the manual on Guam, bent it on Leyte. For them, the manual was a reference, not a rule. The night at Ormoc didn't happen because someone was brave enough to try something crazy. It happened because an older, methodical division saw a problem, ran the numbers, and decided the risk of action was lower than the risk of waiting. That mindset, more than any weapon, made the next 18 minutes possible. 11:55 p.m., December 11th, 1944. The men along the Ormoc waterfront were already in position. No shouting, no last-minute scrambling. Orders had gone out 20 minutes earlier. Nothing had changed since. Track the vessels, wait for illumination, fire on command. The bay in front of them was black, flat, silent, broken only by slow-moving shapes against darker water. 3 ships at first, then 5 total. Transports and barges, heavy with men and equipment, moving slowly because shallow water doesn't forgive speed. Nobody on shore knew for certain if this would work. The M10 tank destroyers had been brought to Leyte to kill German-style armor that didn't exist in the Philippines. Their 3-inch guns had never been fired at ships. Nobody had tested penetration against hull plating. Nobody had deflection tables for waterborne targets. If the Japanese opened fire first, the M10s were open-topped, vulnerable, exposed. This wasn't bravery. This was controlled uncertainty, and it was deliberate. At exactly midnight, the first illumination round left its tube. A 60-millimeter mortar shell climbed into the sky, arced over the bay, and burst 300 feet above the water. White light flooded everything. Ormoc Bay stopped being a shadow and became a diagram. Distances snapped into clarity, angles sharpened. The lead vessel appeared in perfect silhouette, already beached northwest of town, ramps down, troops moving. This is the moment the entire engagement pivoted.
Japanese transport vessels were built to carry men and supplies, not absorb fire. Their hull plating was often less than 1 inch thick, sometimes far less. Against that, the M10 wasn't overkill, it was surgical. The key was where the crews aimed, not at superstructures, not at decks, not at anything dramatic. They aimed at the waterline, below it when possible. Because a ship doesn't need to explode to die, it only needs to lose the battle against water. Once flooding begins faster than pumps can compensate, the outcome is mathematically fixed. Gravity takes over, buoyancy fails, everything else is detail. The M10 crews weren't trying to sink ships the way naval gunners think about sinking ships. They weren't seeking magazine detonations or catastrophic blasts. They were opening holes. 2 holes were enough, sometimes 1. At Ormoc, the first transport began taking on water at an estimated 2,000 gallons per minute after the initial hit. That number alone seals its fate. No damage control team on a lightly built transport can outrun that. The open-topped design of the M10, a liability against artillery and aircraft, gave crews excellent visibility. They could see silhouettes clearly under illumination. They could track movement. They could adjust aim in real time. They weren't firing blind. They were firing deliberately, correcting after each shot as ships listed and settled. That's why follow-up rounds went lower, not higher. They weren't guessing, they were watching the effect and finishing the job. There's nothing heroic about aiming lower to drown a ship faster, but war isn't impressed by drama, it rewards efficiency. The 77th Infantry Division had already learned that lesson on Guam and across Leyte. This was simply that lesson applied to a new target. The other weapons mattered too, but in supporting roles. The 105mm howitzers didn't sink ships by themselves. Their shells weren't designed for penetration. What they did was strip superstructures, kill exposed troops, collapse decks, create chaos. 40mm anti-aircraft guns firing explosive rounds shredded wooden barges and exposed hull sections. Machine guns finished what the water started. None of these systems alone explains the outcome. Together, they made survival impossible.
The second transport was 600 yards out when all guns were cleared to fire. 40mm anti-aircraft guns, normally reserved for aircraft, began hammering surface targets, each gun capable of 120 rounds per minute. Self-propelled howitzers lobbed 105mm high explosive shells, not to penetrate, but to tear superstructures apart through blast and fragmentation. Machine guns raked barges. The M10s reloaded calmly, tracking movement, adjusting elevation. The second transport took a 3-inch round through the bow. The shell detonated among packed troops, killing an estimated 40 men instantly. The captain didn't turn away. Japanese discipline held. He pushed forward until a 105mm shell split the hull open at the waterline. The ship ran aground 400 yards from shore, too deep for troops to wade, too shallow to float free. Men jumped into water over their heads. Many drowned before they could swim. American machine guns found the rest. Transport T-159 was fully submerged by 12:20 a.m. Only the superstructure remained visible. The 3 barges fared worse. One disintegrated under concentrated 40mm fire in 12 seconds. Another tried to turn away and was cut in half by a single 3-inch round. The last made it to 70 yards from shore, grounded in 3 feet of water, and unloaded 50 men directly into interlocking fields of fire. None reached the beach. From first flare to last shot, 18 minutes. 5 Japanese vessels destroyed, approximately 750 enemy troops killed. American casualties, 0. Let me be very clear here. This was not chaos. This was not panic fire. This was synchronized, layered destruction executed exactly as planned. That's what makes it unsettling. There's no hero moment to point at, no single man to elevate, just a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, even if the target was never supposed to be there. When the firing stopped, the bay went dark again. The men on shore didn't cheer, they didn't celebrate, they reloaded, they waited. Because everyone understood one thing: if the Japanese had tried once, they would try again. What happened at Ormoc wasn't luck, and it wasn't improvisation in the romantic sense. It was physics doing exactly what physics always does when steel meets thinner steel at speed. The M10 tank destroyer was never designed to sink ships, but it was designed to do something far more demanding: punch holes through armor that fights back. On the night of December 11th, the targets in the bay weren't armored at all. The 3-inch gun mounted on the M10 fired an armor-piercing round weighing just over 15 pounds. Muzzle velocity approximately 2,600 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, that round could penetrate roughly 3 inches of rolled homogeneous steel. That mattered in Europe, where German tanks were built to survive hits. In Ormoc Bay, it mattered for a very different reason.
What's important is what didn't matter. The Japanese ships didn't have meaningful armor. They didn't have effective counterfire for shore-based guns. They were constrained by shallow water, forced to move slowly, unable to maneuver sharply without grounding. Once committed, they couldn't disengage quickly. In naval terms, they were already dead the moment they crossed into the bay. They just hadn't realized it yet. The Japanese tried again the very next night, December 12, 1944. Just after 10 p.m., 2 barges approached Ormoc Bay from the north, smaller silhouettes this time, lower in the water, faster, built to slip through gaps. The logic was simple. If big transports died, try something smaller. If speed failed, try darkness. If darkness failed, try again anyway. The Americans didn't need a meeting to respond. Illumination went up at 800 yards. The M10s were already laid in. Both barges were destroyed before they crossed 500 yards. Estimated Japanese casualties, 100. American casualties, 0. The math hadn't changed overnight. The third night was the real test. December 13th. The Japanese escalated. One larger transport, possibly 900 tons displacement, carrying an estimated 400 troops and heavy equipment, escorted by 3 barges. This wasn't stubbornness, this was confirmation.
Japanese command needed to know whether Ormoc was still usable, whether the losses of the 11th had been an anomaly, whether there was still a window. The answer came quickly. The transport was hit, then hit again. High explosive tore open the superstructure. A 3-inch round punched through the hull. Flooding followed the same pattern as before. The ship sank in 12 minutes. The escort barges never made it inside 1,000 yards. Estimated Japanese casualties that night, 550. American casualties, 0.
At this point, the story stops being about tactics and starts being about decision-making under pressure. In 3 nights, Japanese command lost approximately 1,300 troops trying to reinforce Ormoc, not in drawn-out ground combat, not over weeks, in minutes. Every attempt followed the same script and ended the same way. Ships destroyed before unloading, survivors trapped in water, no ability to adapt without losing even more men. The Japanese didn't stop because they were surprised. They stopped because the numbers no longer made sense. General Yamashita was ruthless, but he wasn't irrational. He could accept losses if they bought time. What Ormoc now offered was loss without gain. No troops ashore, no supplies delivered, no delay achieved, just dead men and sunken hulls. After December 13th, the convoys stopped. Ormoc Bay was written off, not officially announced, not ceremonially abandoned. It simply went quiet. No more barges probing the darkness, no more transports creeping toward the beach. The funnel closed. The effect on land was immediate and devastating. Japanese forces in the mountains west of Ormoc had been surviving on a thin logistical thread: rice, ammunition, medical supplies, replacements. All of it depended on those nighttime landings. Once they stopped, the clock started ticking. Units ran low on ammunition first, then food, then morale. Wounded men stopped being evacuated. Commanders stopped receiving orders. The battlefield didn't explode, it withered. The 77th Infantry Division advanced north from Ormoc on December 14th. They met resistance, but it was different now. Positions were held longer than they should have been, then abandoned suddenly. Artillery fire became sporadic. Counterattacks lost coordination. By Christmas Day, Leyte was effectively secure. The official campaign statistics tell part of the story. 19,456 Japanese soldiers killed on Leyte by the 77th, 124 captured. American losses: 543 killed, 469 wounded, a kill ratio of 36-1. What those numbers don't include are the ships, the men who never reached shore, the units that never formed because their replacements went to the bottom of Ormoc Bay. That omission matters because it hides the speed of collapse. Without Ormoc, the Japanese 35th Army wasn't defeated by a single decisive battle. It was starved out, cut off, reduced piece by piece. This is why the night of December 11th mattered far beyond the bay itself. It wasn't dramatic the way Midway was dramatic. There was no grand fleet action, no famous admirals, no iconic photographs. But strategically, it slammed a door that could not be reopened. Every mile the Americans advanced after that was cheaper in blood than it would have been a week earlier. Every Japanese position that fell did so without hope of reinforcement. The destruction of those ships didn't just win a firefight, it removed options. And in war, removing options is often more decisive than destroying forces. Once Ormoc was sealed, Leyte's outcome was no longer in doubt. The only remaining question was how long it would take for the consequences to reach every foxhole in the mountains.
In January 1945, the United States Army did something it almost never did in the middle of an ongoing war. It questioned its own report. Not because the outcome was politically inconvenient, not because someone complained, but because the numbers didn't fit the model. An infantry division had reported sinking multiple enemy vessels using tank destroyers. That wasn't a claim you simply filed and moved on from. If it was wrong, it needed correction. If it was right, it meant the Army had just discovered a capability it didn't know it had. An investigation team was sent to Ormoc Bay. By then, the fighting had moved on. The beaches were quiet. The water was shallow and clear at low tide. Divers went down and found transport T-159 resting in roughly 15 feet of water. The hull was intact enough to examine. They measured the holes. 2 clean entry points on the starboard side, both approximately 3 inches in diameter, both below the waterline. The spacing matched the firing reports. The angles matched the shoreline positions of the M10 guns. There was no ambiguity. Steel records truth better than memory ever will. The second transport lay in deeper water. Navy divers reached it as well. They found 3 penetrations, 2 consistent with 3-inch armor-piercing rounds, 1 consistent with a 105mm high-explosive shell. Fragments were recovered from the seabed. Metallurgical analysis traced them to armor-piercing rounds manufactured in 1944 at Watervliet Arsenal in New York. There was no room left for doubt. The after-action reports were accurate. The timeline was accurate. The results were real. The conclusion was simple and unsettling. The 77th Infantry Division had, in fact, sunk enemy vessels using armored fighting vehicles firing from shore positions. This was the only confirmed instance of its kind in the Second World War. Not in the Pacific, not in Europe, nowhere. This is where most stories would end with celebration, medals, headlines, men pulled aside for interviews. None of that happened. No special commendations were issued for sinking ships. The action was categorized as part of the normal defense of Ormoc. The M10 crews returned to their primary role, destroying fortifications, supporting infantry, preparing for Okinawa. The moment passed without ceremony. General Andrew Bruce mentioned the engagement exactly once in his memoirs. 1 sentence. He wrote that the division had demonstrated unusual flexibility in employing all available weapons against enemy forces, regardless of whether those weapons were designed for the task. Tanks had never sunk ships before. They would never do it again.
That was it. No flourish, no emphasis. For him, it was simply confirmation that his philosophy worked. The Army did make one quiet change. In March 1945, the technical manual for the M10 tank destroyer was updated. A new section was added, Employment Against Naval Targets, 3 paragraphs long. It noted that 3-inch armor-piercing rounds could penetrate unarmored vessels at ranges up to 1,000 yards. It recommended aiming at the waterline to maximize flooding, and it cited Ormoc Bay as the reference case. The update was clinical, almost indifferent, as if the Army was acknowledging a footnote rather than a historical anomaly. And then the opportunity vanished. The Japanese never attempted another large-scale amphibious reinforcement under American shore guns. The war moved on to Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, where defenders were already in place. There were no more Ormocs, no more moments where ships crept toward beaches under improvised coastal fire. The lesson existed, but the battlefield never asked for it again. The men who fired those 15 rounds went on with their war. They fought on Okinawa, they lost friends, they survived. Most never spoke publicly about sinking ships. To them, it was just another night where the job had to be done. One of the last surviving crew members died in 2003. His family didn't know the story until they read his service records after his death. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons,
a citation that mentioned engaging enemy naval vessels with tank destroyer fire. That was all. So what do we take from this? Ormoc Bay still looks unimportant on a map. The water is calm, the wrecks are buried under silt. But for 18 minutes in December 1944, that bay decided the fate of an entire campaign, and it did it in a way that has never been repeated. This wasn't about heroes, it was about a group of older men who understood cost, who'd learned to treat war as a problem to be solved efficiently rather than a stage for proving bravery. It was about a doctrine that said firepower matters more than courage, that mathematics beats slogans, that the manual is a reference, not a rule. And it was about the moment when reality refused to cooperate with expectations, when thin steel met high velocity and the impossible became routine. The night tanks sank ships. The night the old bastards closed the door on an entire Japanese strategy with 15 rounds and 18 minutes. The night that proved sometimes the most decisive victories aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the ones that remove options, seal funnels, and force the enemy to realize there's no path forward anymore. Just dead water, silent guns, and a lesson written in steel that would never be needed again.